All right, ladies and gentlemen and graphic designers, so far we've learned about what is logo, we've learned about the elements of graphic design, and now we're going to learn about the principles of graphic design. The principles are basically how you use the elements. So like you could put line shapes, colors, textures together and have a really crummy looking logo or crummy looking magazine layout. Okay, but if you follow some guidelines, follow some rules, do some things, you can have like a really nice one. So here are the rules: movement, emphasis, proximity, balance, proportion, harmony, white space, repetition, color, and unity. All right. So so movement is the use of lines, color, and repetition to create the illusion of motion. Okay, so you can create motion through curved forms or lines. So you have curved and you have repeated curves. That gives the idea of motion. Repetition. So you have the repetition of all these triangles, and that makes it look like it's moving. You can have fuzzy lines. Um, so that those were not only are repeated, but they're also fuzzy. Okay, so you got repeated, you got curvy, repeated. Any rate, movement. How are the lines used in the composition on this slide? Well, you have these are curved and repeated, and it creates the idea of a ripple effect on the water that's moving. Um, Okay, so my advanced graphic design students, make sure you actually do this part. I definitely do want you to do these notes, and I understand that it's repetition. We're not going to do a ton of repetition this year, but on this particular spiel, it's really good review that we need to do. So actually do this in your Google Doc. Okay, so emphasis is a rule or guideline that you could use in your artwork. Okay, so here there's no emphasis here. This is emphasized because of color. Okay. Okay, so what is emphasized and how is it emphasized? Well, in this one, the chef is emphasized because everything else is kind of moody and dark, and he has this bright white. Okay, so we emphasized him through the brightness of it. How about this one? What's emphasized? Well, it's this cowboy because everything else is kind of gray tones, and then he has an orange shirt. Okay, so you can emphasize through contrast. So you can have something contrasted with other things. So for example, in this thing, there's tons of different, if we look at this, there's tons of different contrasts. Okay, so notice the contrast of the light background with the dark foreground. Okay, the contrast of the dark shadows on the teapot. So you have this teapot, there's the dark shadow area. Um, Thin and thick lines. So you have like really thin lines, you have thick lines, you have thick lines, you have thin lines. You have mostly stray stuff, and then up here you have curve, and over here you have curve. Um, okay, so you have the dark steam, so this is dark, and then you have these clouds in the distance that are light. Their shapes are similar, but the color is different. So tons of different contrasts. All right, other thing is this. So Sting is a singer, and he has um, this logo. Well, what's emphasized in it? Well, it's the eye looks like a bee stinger, and it's set below everything else, so it stands out because of its how it's aligned differently. Okay, so go ahead and do this in your Google Doc. Answer these questions. Find a logo that has achieved emphasis or contrast, and answer these questions. Okay, I do want you to answer these questions on your Google Doc. What is the difference between an element of graphic design and a principle of graphic design? How are they related, and how could I add emphasis to this image? I'm going to help you answer these. Okay, so an element of graphic design are the building blocks, the line shapes. It's the thing that you use. The principle of graphic design are rules or guidelines that tell you how to use them. So, for example, so the color right here is yellow, so the color is the building blocks. The principal would say, hey, if you want emphasis, why don't you change this color to something different so it's emphasized? How are the elements and principles related? So the principles are guidelines on how to use the elements. How could I add emphasis to this image? You could change the color of it. You could move something over here, change the alignment so it's way different. You could make one thing way bigger than the other. There's lots of ways you could emphasize this. Okay, so we're going to continue on with the principles of graphic design. So proximity groupings. So if you put something far away from other things, it makes it seem different. Even though this nut looks exactly like all these other nuts, you think, hey, there's something different about it. There must be something different about it because it's far away. And on the other hand, when you see something, it's like, oh, that thing kind of belongs over there, not over here. So when you have something with a different color or texture or whatever that's close, it's like it makes you wonder about it. Okay, so what do you see in the first picture? A lot of, I don't know what you see. Some people see bread, some people see a coffee cup steaming, other people see um, a Viking ship. I don't know what it's supposed to be. I think it's supposed to be a Viking ship. I don't know. What do you see in the first picture? How many shapes are there? 1, 2, 3, 4. What do you see in the second picture? You see an eagle with a sun around it. How many shapes are there? I don't know. Count them up. Why do they look? They're separate shapes, but they seem to be one thing. Separate shapes, but they give you the idea of one thing. Why is that? Because of close proximity. They're close together. Because they're close, they appear to be one thing. Skip that. Skip that. Skip that. Okay, do this. Okay, and do that in your notes. Okay, so balance is important, right? So you can have one big thing and two little things that would actually balance out in real life. You have two things that are equally spaced, that would balance out in real life. You have, so these things would all balance out in real life. Okay, how did the artist make the logo look balanced? Well, he put everything, it's equal on this side and that side. How did the artist make this thing look balanced? Well, he put the big thing closer to the center and the small thing farther away, so in real life something like that would actually balance out. So there's different kinds of balance um, and symmetry and so on and so forth. Well, okay, but I want you to do this. Okay, proportion is things that are pleasing to the eye. So this is bad. Things that are equal are kind of boring. We don't like it. But we sort of like this. So if we break it up into a thirds, our eyes like this better. It's more pleasing to the eyes. So same thing here. We like this proportion. This is too small. So instead of a third, it's like a fifth or something. It's a little bit too small. And we see it's interesting that for some reason we like some proportions and not others. But if you take a, oh, here's another idea of harmony. Um, so we like this. We don't like this. This would be on like a regular logo. This would be on something like a spooky Halloween logo that we wanted to be kind of not have harmony. Okay, so if you take a look at, here's a classic example of proportion. Like if you look at the size of this line to that line, that's like a third. So they use nice proportion on it. So see if you can find a logo that has good proportion. We have white space and negative space, so you can see the little faces were made out of white space. So basically the artist drew something with the paper. Same thing here, we had black paper and we drew half of the cowboy with the paper. Okay. Here's other examples. There's an F drawn with the paper. This is not really a closed shape, so there's not really a panda there, but we see the panda even though we drew half of him with the paper. There's a heart, there's a cityscape all drawn with the paper. Okay, so do this into your notes. So repetition is used a lot, oftentimes to create the sense of motion. Okay, so if you, and it's also not just for motion. There's all kinds of things. So if you look at this, you can see that the squares are repeated, right? And you see also the circle repeated. You got the circle, and then you have the kind of the shadowy of a circle there. You have you have rectangle, 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 and on this particular one, it creates kind of a looming effect, almost like it's falling over. So there is kind of a sense of motion to that. Okay, do this one on repetition. And so this one, if you look at it, it has, it's balanced, okay? It has proportion, so it has nice proportion between the shapes. It's drawing stuff with negative space. It has repetition of the line, line, line. So a lot of logos will incorporate many of the principles, okay? So complementary colors are colors that are opposite of each other on the color wheel. Analogous colors are colors that are side by side. Okay, so if you have complementary colors here, these are analogous colors. So if you had yellow writing on a green background, it wouldn't show up very well, but if you had yellow writing on a purple background, it would because they create contrast. So these, you put these together to be kind of smooth and they don't stand out. You put these together if you want one to stand out away from the other. Okay. Here's another word for color. Saturation is the intensity or purity of a color from white to gray or saturated. So this is saturated, and this is totally desaturated over here. So to desaturated color, you can add white, black, gray. So a tint is things mixed with white, so they took the saturated blue, they added white, and so these are tints of the saturated blue. A tone is when you add gray, so same thing, super saturated, less saturated, and a shade is when you add black, so tints, tones, shades. All these are monochromatic because you started with the same color. Okay, again, if you have the purple or blue and yellow, it's good contrast. This is effective. It's not effective if you want to create contrast. It is effective if you want something that's kind of smooth and blends well together. Okay, finally, I think this is final. Finally, we have the principle of unity. It's the final result in a composition when all the elements work harmoniously together. So if you're using the elements and the principles well, you'll have a logo or a design that has unity. So unity is achieved when all of the design principles, such as balance, movement, emphasis, contrast, have been correctly applied. They all work well together. Okay, so that is it for my spiel. I'm hoping that you have learned stuff and that you can apply this to your